September 1942, the Solomon Islands. A narrow ridge covered in kunai grass, no more than 1,000 yards long, rises from the jungle like a scar on the earth. On this ridge, 840 American Marines, exhausted, outnumbered, and nearly out of ammunition, are about to face something that military historians will debate for decades. 3,000 elite Japanese soldiers are moving through the darkness toward them. The Japanese commander has studied American positions for weeks. He knows exactly where the Marines are dug in. He knows their supply lines are stretched thin. He knows that if his men take this ridge, Henderson Field, the only American airstrip in the Pacific, falls with it. And if Henderson Field falls, so does America's entire strategy in the Pacific War. What happens over the next 14 hours will become one of the most extraordinary last stands in military history. Not because the Marines held their ground, but because of how they held it and what it cost the Japanese force that tried to break them. This is the story of Edson's Ridge. The story of men who chose to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. The story of a battle that changed the course of World War II. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Now let's continue. To understand what happened on that ridge in September 1942, you need to understand what brought the Marines to Guadalcanal in the first place. And to understand that, you need to understand the darkest days of the Pacific War. 6 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, the Japanese Empire had launched a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack came on a quiet Sunday morning when most of the Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in the shallow waters of the harbor. In less than 2 hours, Japanese aircraft sank or damaged 21 American ships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,400 Americans. The shock that rippled across the United States was profound. Many Americans had never heard of Pearl Harbor before that day. Now it was seared into the national consciousness, a symbol of treachery, of surprise, of a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. In the months that followed, Japan's military machine swept across the Pacific like a typhoon. The Philippines fell after a brutal siege that ended with the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands of American and Filipino prisoners died from exhaustion, starvation, and Japanese cruelty. Wake Island fell after a heroic 2-week defense by Marines who killed hundreds of Japanese attackers before being overwhelmed. Guam fell in a matter of hours. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, fell in a humiliation that shook the foundations of the colonial world. By the summer of 1942, Japan controlled a territory that stretched from the borders of India to the islands of Alaska. Their navy had crushed Allied fleets in engagement after engagement. Their army seemed unstoppable. Their pilots dominated the skies. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, Japan's euphemism for its colonial empire, was becoming a reality. The American public, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, desperately needed a victory. But more importantly, military strategists needed to stop Japan's advance before it reached Australia. If Australia fell, or even if it was simply cut off from American supply lines, the war in the Pacific might become unwinnable. The strategists pored over maps, looking for the right place to make a stand. They needed somewhere that mattered, somewhere Japan couldn't ignore. They needed a place where American forces could dig in and fight, where the Japanese would be forced to attack at a disadvantage. The answer was a small, malaria-infested island that most Americans had never heard of: Guadalcanal. The island sat at the southern end of the Solomon Islands chain, a place of dense jungle, sweltering heat, and tropical diseases that would kill more men than bullets in the months to come. It was roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered almost entirely by impenetrable rainforest, crocodile-infested rivers, and volcanic mountains that disappeared into the clouds. Japanese construction crews had begun building an airfield there in early 1942. If that airfield became operational with Japanese planes, it would give Japan control of the shipping lanes between the United States and Australia. American convoys would be within easy range of Japanese bombers. The lifeline that kept Australia in the war would be severed. The Americans couldn't let that happen. On August 7, 1942, 11,000 Marines of the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal's beaches. It was the first major American offensive of the Pacific War, the moment when the United States stopped retreating and started fighting back. The landing was called Operation Watchtower, though the men who fought there would remember it by another name, Operation Shoestring, because they were doing it with almost nothing. The Marines took the airfield easily enough. Japanese construction crews fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and half-finished runways. The Marines renamed it Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot who had been killed leading a bombing run at the Battle of Midway 2 months earlier. For a few hours, it seemed like the operation might be a success. The Marines had achieved tactical surprise. The airfield was in American hands, supplies were flowing ashore, but that night, the Japanese Navy struck back with devastating force. In the waters off nearby Savo Island, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa caught the Allied naval screen completely by surprise. The Japanese approached in the darkness, their ships running silent, their crews at battle stations. The Allied ships, a mixture of American and Australian cruisers and destroyers, were unprepared, their crews exhausted from 2 days of almost continuous combat operations. The battle that followed was a masterpiece of Japanese night-fighting tactics. Mikawa's ships swept through the Allied formation like wolves through sheep, their long-lance torpedoes finding target after target. The American cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria were sunk in rapid succession, their magazines exploding, their crews dying in the dark waters. The Australian cruiser Canberra was mortally wounded and had to be scuttled the next day. In 32 minutes of brutal night fighting, the Japanese sank 4 heavy cruisers and killed more than 1,000 sailors. It was, and remains, one of the worst naval defeats in American history. The waters off Savo Island would earn the name Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships that now lay on its floor. The surviving Allied ships withdrew, taking with them the transports that carried the Marines' heavy equipment, most of their ammunition, and half their food supplies. The 11,000 men on Guadalcanal were suddenly alone, surrounded by enemy-controlled waters, with supplies for only a few days of fighting. And somewhere in the jungle, Japanese army units were already moving toward them. The situation was desperate. The Marines had captured an airfield, but without planes, it was just a flat piece of ground. They had weapons, but limited ammunition. They had food for perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3 if they stretched it. They were surrounded by an enemy who controlled the sea and the air. Major General Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, gathered his officers and laid out the situation in stark terms. They were on their own. Relief might come in weeks, or it might never come at all. Their job was to hold Henderson Field no matter what it cost. If the airfield fell, everything they had suffered would be for nothing. The Marines who defended Henderson Field in those first weeks were operating on half rations, drinking water from streams that bred disease and fighting an enemy they often couldn't see. The supply situation was critical beyond anything most of these young men had experienced. The Navy had pulled out, taking most of their food, ammunition, and equipment with them. What remained had to be carefully rationed. Each Marine received 2 meals a day instead of 3. and even those meals were barely enough to sustain a man doing light work, let alone one fighting in tropical heat against a determined enemy. The captured Japanese supplies helped, but they weren't designed for American tastes or American equipment. The rice was unfamiliar to most Marines. The ammunition fit Japanese weapons, not American ones. The trucks and bulldozers were essential for finishing Henderson Field, but they were already worn from heavy use and prone to breakdown. The men adapted because they had no choice. They learned to eat rice. They learned to make do with less. They learned that hunger was something you could push past if you had to, that discomfort was temporary, that the mission mattered more than their individual comfort. Japanese snipers tied themselves into trees, sometimes staying in position for days, waiting for a clear shot at an officer or a machine gunner. These snipers were patient, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. They would drink their own urine to avoid having to climb down from their positions. They would remain motionless for hours, waiting for the perfect shot. And when they fired, they rarely missed. The Marines learned to hate the snipers more than any other enemy. Regular Japanese soldiers you could fight, could close with, could see and kill. The snipers were invisible death, striking without warning, killing men who thought they were safe. The psychological effect was devastating. Marines became paranoid, jumping at shadows, afraid to move in daylight. Small groups of Japanese soldiers infiltrated American lines at night, slitting throats and throwing grenades before melting back into the darkness. These infiltrators were volunteers, men who had accepted that they probably wouldn't survive the night, but were determined to kill as many Americans as possible before they died. The infiltration tactics were terrifying in their effectiveness. A Marine might fall asleep in his foxhole, exhausted from the day's work, and simply never wake up. His throat would be cut so cleanly that his squad mates wouldn't know anything was wrong until they tried to wake him in the morning. The Marines developed countermeasures. They slept in shifts, one man awake while his buddy rested. They strung tripwires around their positions, attached to tin cans filled with pebbles that would rattle if disturbed. They learned to listen for the sounds that didn't belong, the rustle of vegetation moving against the wind, the soft pad of footsteps in mud. But the infiltrators kept coming, and men kept dying. The jungle itself seemed to be fighting against them. The heat was oppressive, temperatures climbing above 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. Humidity was so high that metal rusted overnight, that leather grew mold in days, that nothing ever dried. Rain came in sheets, turning foxholes into swimming pools, washing away defensive positions, making movement almost impossible. And then there were the diseases. Malaria swept through the ranks like wildfire. Men shook with fever in their foxholes, barely able to lift their rifles. Dysentery left strong Marines doubled over in pain, losing weight they couldn't afford to lose. Fungal infections rotted boots off men's feet. The jungle was killing Americans as efficiently as the Japanese, but they held. In the aftermath of the battle, as the sun rose over the blood-soaked ridge, the Marines took stock of what they had survived. Men who had fought through the night without food, without water, without hope of relief, finally allowed themselves to breathe. Some collapsed where they stood, exhaustion overwhelming them now that the adrenaline was gone. Others sat in their foxholes, staring at nothing, their minds struggling to process what they had experienced. A few wept openly, overwhelmed by grief for fallen friends, by relief at their own survival, by the sheer intensity of what they had been through. The corpsmen moved through the positions, treating the wounded, marking the dead. They worked with quiet efficiency, their faces expressionless, doing a job that no one should ever have to do. Some of the wounded could be saved if they got to a hospital ship quickly enough. Others were beyond help, their wounds too severe, their bodies too broken. The dead were gathered and laid out in rows, their bodies covered with ponchos and shelter halves. There would be time later for proper burials, for the rituals that give meaning to death. For now, the living had to focus on securing what they had won. Details were sent out to recover weapons and ammunition from the battlefield. Every round counted. Every rifle might be needed if the Japanese attacked again. The Marines who performed this grim work tried not to look too closely at the bodies they passed, tried not to think about the fact that some of those bodies had been trying to kill them just hours earlier. The smell of death hung over the ridge, a sickly sweet odor that would haunt the survivors for years. Mixed with the smell of cordite and the ever-present humidity of the jungle, it created an atmosphere that seemed to belong to some other world. A world of death and violence that had nothing to do with the peaceful lives these young men had lived before the war. By noon, the first reinforcements began arriving from Henderson Field. Fresh troops, men who had spent the night listening to the distant sounds of battle, wondering if their friends would survive. They brought water, ammunition, and rations, supplies that seemed impossibly luxurious to men who had fought through the night with nothing. The relief on the faces of the raiders was evident. They had done their job. They had held the ridge. Now, someone else would take over the watch while they got some rest. But there wasn't much rest to be had. The Japanese were still out there, still dangerous, still capable of launching another attack. The Marines who had survived Edson's Ridge were reorganized, given what supplies could be spared, and sent to take up new positions on the perimeter. The war wasn't over. It wouldn't be over for another 3 years. But something had changed on that ridge, something important. The Marines knew it. The Japanese knew it. The world would eventually know it. The tide had turned. They held. They finished Henderson Field with captured Japanese equipment, bulldozers and trucks and construction supplies that the fleeing Japanese had left behind. They beat back Japanese probes, and slowly, painfully, they began to understand the enemy they were facing. The Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were not ordinary troops. Many were veterans of campaigns in China, hardened by years of brutal fighting. They believed in their emperor with a fervor that American soldiers found almost impossible to comprehend. Surrender was not just discouraged, it was unthinkable. To die in battle was an honor. To be captured was eternal shame. This made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. A wounded American soldier might surrender when further resistance was pointless. A wounded Japanese soldier would often hide a grenade, waiting to kill anyone who came to help him. American medics learned to approach wounded enemies with extreme caution if they approached at all. The Japanese infantry tactics were unlike anything the Americans had faced before. Where Western armies used fire and maneuver, the Japanese favored the direct assault, mass charges designed to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers and fighting spirit. They called it Seishin, the triumph of spirit over material, the belief that a properly motivated soldier could overcome any obstacle, no matter how great. In China, against poorly trained and equipped troops, this approach had worked. Against American Marines with automatic weapons and artillery support, it would prove catastrophic. But the Japanese didn't know that yet, and neither did the Americans. By early September, intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese were massing forces for a major assault. Coast watchers, Australian and New Zealand personnel hidden throughout the Solomon Islands, reported heavy naval traffic. Captured documents suggested that significant reinforcements had landed on the island's western end. The pattern of enemy activity had changed. Japanese patrols were more aggressive, pushing closer to the American perimeter, probing for weaknesses. Aircraft reconnaissance showed supply dumps being established in the jungle, concentrations of troops moving along trails that led toward Henderson Field. The question was where the attack would come from and when. The man responsible for figuring that out was Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Austin Edson. At 45, Edson was old for a combat commander, with thinning red hair that had earned him the nickname Red Mike. He spoke quietly, rarely raised his voice, and had a habit of chewing on an unlit cigar while studying maps for hours at a time. But beneath that calm exterior was one of the most aggressive combat leaders in the Marine Corps. Edson had fought bandits in Nicaragua during the Banana Wars of the 1920s, where he had learned the art of jungle warfare in the most unforgiving school imaginable. He had led jungle patrols in China, observing Japanese tactics and taking careful notes. He had helped develop the Marine Corps' amphibious assault doctrine, the techniques that were now being used across the Pacific. Edson understood small unit tactics better than almost anyone in the Marine Corps, and he had an almost supernatural sense for terrain. He could look at a map and see things that other officers missed: the covered approaches, the likely assembly areas, the key terrain features that would determine the outcome of a battle. When Edson looked at the maps of Henderson Field's defenses, one feature stood out immediately. South of the airfield, a grassy ridge ran roughly north-south for about 1,000 yards before disappearing into the jungle. It was the highest ground in the immediate area, and it pointed directly at Henderson Field like an arrow. The ridge had several features that made it tactically significant. Its eastern and western slopes dropped away into thick jungle, channeling any attack along its spine. Its northern end was only a few hundred yards from the airfield itself, and the jungle to its south provided excellent concealment for an attacking force. If Edson were planning an assault on the airfield, he would use that ridge, and Edson was confident that the Japanese commander, whoever he was, would reach the same conclusion. On September 10th, Edson led his unit, the 1st Marine Raider Battalion, to that ridge. He told his men they were taking up a rest area away from the front lines. Nobody believed him. Raiders didn't get rest areas. The 1st Marine Raider Battalion was an elite unit, hand-picked volunteers trained for special operations, the kind of missions that were too dangerous or too demanding for regular troops. They had been created in early 1942, modeled partly on the British Commandos, designed to be the cutting edge of American offensive capability in the Pacific. The battalion that dug in on that ridge had already been through hell. They had conducted the first American ground offensive of the war at Tulagi, a small island near Guadalcanal, just a few days before the main landings. They had lost good men there, fighting hand-to-hand in caves and bunkers, clearing Japanese positions one bloody yard at a time. The fighting at Tulagi had been a preview of what was to come. The Japanese garrison, about 350 men, had fought to almost the last man. They had counterattacked repeatedly, sometimes successfully, sometimes suicidally. They had refused to surrender even when their situation was hopeless. The raiders had learned that taking a Japanese position meant killing everyone in it. Now they were exhausted, under strength, and spread across a position that was far too wide for their numbers. Many of the original raiders had been killed or wounded at Tulagi. Their replacements were good men, but they hadn't been through the same training, didn't have the same cohesion that came from months of working together. Edson had about 840 men to defend a ridge nearly 1,000 yards long. Standard military doctrine called for far more troops to hold such a position, but standard military doctrine assumed you had the troops to spare. The raiders didn't. So Edson did what he always did. He improvised. He placed his strongest companies on the ridge's northern end, closest to Henderson Field. These were the positions that absolutely had to hold. If the Japanese broke through here, they would be on the airfield in minutes. He anchored his flanks on the jungle as best he could, even though he knew the jungle offered poor defensive terrain. The vegetation was too thick for clear fields of fire, too dense to allow rapid reinforcement of threatened positions. The flanks would have to hold with fewer men, relying on the difficulty of the terrain to slow any Japanese advance. He positioned his command post on a small knoll about 300 yards south of the airfield, where he could see the entire length of the ridge. It wasn't the safest place. It was actually dangerously exposed. But Edson needed to see what was happening if he was going to make the quick decisions that combat required. He ordered his men to dig deep foxholes, at least 4 feet down, with logs and sandbags overhead for protection against artillery. He registered artillery concentrations along the ridge's approaches, giving the supporting batteries precise coordinates so they could drop shells exactly where they were needed. He established communication lines, laid wire for field telephones, set up runners in case the wire was cut. Then he waited. The night of September 12th was quiet. Too quiet. Edson walked the lines, checking positions, speaking quietly with his men. He could feel something building, the way old soldiers sometimes can. The jungle seemed to be holding its breath. The heat was stifling, even after dark. The men lay in their foxholes, sweat soaking through their dungarees, listening to the sounds of the jungle, the chorus of insects, the occasional screech of a bird, the rustle of things moving through the undergrowth. Every sound made them tense, made them grip their weapons tighter, made them peer into the darkness, looking for enemies that might or might not be there. Just before midnight, a Japanese reconnaissance patrol probed the raiders' positions on the ridge's southern end. A brief firefight broke out, muzzle flashes lighting the darkness, tracers arcing through the night. Flares shot up, casting stark white light over the battlefield for a few seconds before burning out. Then silence returned. But Edson knew what that meant. The main attack was coming. He was right. What Edson didn't know, couldn't know, was the scale of what was about to hit him. Japanese Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had landed approximately 6,000 soldiers on Guadalcanal's eastern coast over the previous weeks. His force included some of the best infantry in the Japanese army, the 124th Infantry Regiment, veterans of the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, along with elements of the 4th Infantry Regiment, which had fought in China. Kawaguchi's plan was elegant in its simplicity. While naval bombardment and diversionary attacks fixed the Marines' attention on the coastline and the western approaches, his main force would strike through the jungle and take Henderson Field from the south. The route of attack would take them directly up the ridge, where Edson's raiders were now digging in. Kawaguchi was a professional soldier who had studied American tactics and dispositions. He had intercepted radio communications, analyzed patrol patterns, and interrogated captured Marines. He knew the Americans were spread thin. He knew their supply situation was desperate. What he didn't know was that he was about to run his best troops directly into the teeth of the most elite American unit on the island. The approach march had been brutal. Kawaguchi's men had spent days hacking through jungle that would have stopped most armies. The terrain was almost impassable. Steep ravines, streams swollen by recent rains, vegetation so thick that men could barely see the soldier in front of them. They had to carry everything on their backs: weapons, ammunition, rice, water. Many had not eaten in 48 hours. The supply situation had broken down completely. The jungle had swallowed the supply columns, separated units from their support, turned a coordinated offensive into a series of isolated advances. Officers had lost contact with their higher headquarters. Units that were supposed to attack together found themselves miles apart. But Kawaguchi pushed forward. He had been given a mission: take Henderson Field. The Emperor expected victory. Failure was not an option that any Japanese officer could contemplate. September 13th dawned hot and humid, like every other day on Guadalcanal. The sun rose over the jungle, burning away the morning mist, beginning another day of heat and discomfort. The raiders in their foxholes ate cold rations. They couldn't risk cooking fires, and waited. Edson spent the morning making adjustments to his positions. He had decided to pull back some of his forward units, shortening his lines and concentrating his men on the most defensible terrain. Some of his officers questioned the move. It gave up ground without a fight, ground that would have to be retaken later. Edson didn't argue. He just told them to dig in deeper. He knew something they didn't. During the night, native scouts had reported large Japanese concentrations in the jungle to the south. The enemy force was far larger than intelligence had estimated, perhaps 3,000 men, maybe more. Edson's original deployment, spread across nearly 1,000 yards of front, wouldn't survive the first assault. Better to give up ground now, while they could do it in good order, than to have their lines shattered in the opening minutes of the battle. That afternoon, Japanese naval aircraft bombed the ridge. The raiders pressed themselves into their foxholes while explosions tore the kunai grass apart, sending showers of dirt and debris raining down on them. The bombing was terrifying, the scream of the engines, the whistle of the falling bombs, the massive detonations that shook the earth itself. Then Japanese artillery opened up, shells screaming in from positions hidden in the jungle. The shells came in waves, each one sounding like a freight train before it exploded. Men hugged the bottom of their foxholes, praying that the next shell wouldn't land directly on top of them. For men who had been living on half rations and little sleep, it felt like the end of the world. The noise was incredible, overwhelming, impossible to think through. The explosions seemed to come from everywhere at once. Dirt filled men's eyes and mouths. The concussions left ears ringing, heads pounding. But the raiders had built good positions. The foxholes were deep enough to provide protection from everything but a direct hit. The logs and sandbags overhead stopped most of the shrapnel. Casualties were lighter than the bombardment might have suggested. When the shells stopped falling, the men climbed out of their holes, brushed off the dirt, and prepared for what they knew was coming next. As darkness fell on September 13th, the jungle south of the ridge began to move. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were picking their way through the undergrowth, moving toward the American positions. They moved as quietly as they could, but 3,000 men couldn't approach in complete silence. The raiders heard them coming, the rustle of vegetation, the clink of equipment, the occasional whispered command. The Japanese had been marching for days through terrain that would have stopped most armies. Many had not eaten in 48 hours. They were exhausted, dehydrated, suffering from malaria and dysentery. But they were about to demonstrate why the Japanese soldier was considered the most formidable infantry fighter in the Pacific. They believed. They believed in their emperor, in their cause, in the superiority of Japanese spirit over American materiel. They had been told that the Marines were soft, that Americans couldn't fight, that one Japanese soldier was worth 10 of the enemy. They were about to prove those beliefs, or die trying. The first attack came just after 2100 hours, 9 p.m. Japanese soldiers erupted from the jungle on the ridge's eastern flank, screaming at the tops of their lungs. The night exploded with muzzle flashes, the crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns. Flares shot up, casting stark white light over the battlefield. The Japanese came in a wave, hundreds of men charging together, bayonets fixed, their war cries echoing off the hills. This was the essence of Japanese infantry tactics, the banzai charge. The idea was to close with the enemy so quickly that superior American firepower couldn't be brought to bear. In close combat, Japanese soldiers believed their spirit and training would overwhelm any opponent. On this night, they almost succeeded. The Japanese assault crashed into Company B on the ridge's eastern end. The company commander, Captain John Sweeney, had positioned his men well, but there were simply too many Japanese and too few Marines. Within minutes, the company's lines were penetrated in multiple places. Fighting became hand-to-hand, Marines and Japanese soldiers grappling in the darkness, killing each other with bayonets, entrenching tools and bare hands. The darkness made everything more chaotic, more terrifying. Men couldn't tell friend from enemy until they were close enough to touch. Muzzle flashes blinded anyone who looked at them, leaving purple after-images that made the darkness even more impenetrable. Private John Stowers, 19 years old and from a small town in Oklahoma, found himself facing 3 Japanese soldiers who had broken through his squad's position. They came at him out of the darkness, bayonets gleaming in the light of a flare. Stowers shot the first one with his rifle, bayoneted the second, and beat the third to death with his rifle butt, when his bayonet stuck in the second man's body. When dawn came, they found Stowers still at his post, wounded in 4 places, surrounded by enemy dead. He had killed at least 7 Japanese soldiers during the night, holding his position alone after his squad mates were killed or driven back. He would spend 3 months in a hospital ship, recovering from his wounds. Company B fell back, fighting for every yard. Their commander, Captain Sweeney, rallied his men again and again, leading counterattacks into the darkness until a Japanese bullet took him through the chest. He kept fighting for another 10 minutes, blood soaking through his dungarees, before blood loss finally dropped him. A corpsman dragged Sweeney to relative safety and tried to stop the bleeding. Sweeney kept asking about his men, kept trying to get back to the fighting, until loss of blood finally made him lose consciousness. He would survive, though the recovery took almost a year. By 2300 hours, the Japanese had pushed Company B off its original positions and were threatening to break through to Henderson Field. The situation was critical. If the Japanese could push through the gap they had created, they would be behind the Marine lines, able to attack the airfield from multiple directions. Edson called in artillery support. The 11th Marines had pre-registered the ridge, and now their 105mm howitzers began dropping shells directly in front of the Marine positions. The artillery officers were taking a risk. The shells were falling within 100 yards of friendly positions. But Edson knew that if the artillery didn't break up the Japanese attack, there wouldn't be any friendly positions left to worry about. The effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers who had braved rifle and machine gun fire found themselves torn apart by high explosives. The shells came in salvos, each burst sending shrapnel scything through the massed infantry. Men who had been charging toward the Marine lines were suddenly blown backward, their bodies torn and broken. The attack wavered, then stopped. In the darkness, officers screamed orders, trying to reorganize their shattered formations. NCOs grabbed men and pushed them into new positions. The Japanese were hurt, but they weren't broken, not yet. A brief lull settled over the ridge. Both sides caught their breath, tended their wounded, redistributed ammunition. Edson walked his lines again, speaking calmly to his men, telling them to hold on just a little longer. "They're hurt," he told them. "They've got to be hurting worse than we are. We just have to hold until morning." The men believed him. They had to believe him. During the lull, the Marines could hear the Japanese reorganizing, officers shouting commands, the sounds of men moving through the jungle. The clink of equipment being redistributed. They were coming again. The Japanese attacked again at 0200 hours. This time, the main assault came straight up the spine of the ridge, directly at Edson's command post. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged out of the jungle, their bayonets gleaming in the light of flares. Behind them came more hundreds, and more behind those. This was the decisive effort. Kawaguchi had concentrated his remaining strength for one massive push that would break through the Marine Center and take Henderson Field. He had gathered every man who could still fight, every soldier who had survived the march through the jungle and the first night's fighting. Major Kenneth Bailey, Edson's executive officer, organized the defense of the command post. Bailey was a giant of a man, well over 6 feet tall, with a voice that could be heard over any battlefield. He had been with Edson since the start, one of the original raiders, a man who had proven his courage 100 times over. Bailey stood in the open, directing fire, completely exposed to enemy bullets. His men begged him to take cover. He ignored them. His job was to see what was happening, to direct the defense, to make sure every Marine knew where to shoot. He couldn't do that from a foxhole. When Japanese soldiers broke through the perimeter, Bailey grabbed a rifle and led a counterattack personally. He gathered a handful of men and charged into the darkness, screaming for the Japanese to come and fight. They closed with the enemy at close range, bayonets against bayonets, the fighting so chaotic that nobody knew who was winning. Bailey was wounded in the throat by a grenade fragment. The explosion knocked him down, sent blood pouring down his chest. A corpsman tried to treat him. Bailey pushed the corpsman away, grabbed his rifle, and went back to the fighting. He led 3 more counterattacks over the next hour, each time driving the Japanese back, each time buying a few more minutes for the men defending the command post. On the 4th counterattack, a Japanese bullet caught him in the head. Major Kenneth Bailey died instantly. He was 31 years old. He would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night, posthumously. His citation noted that his aggressive leadership and selfless devotion to duty sustained and enhanced the esprit de corps of his command and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The words couldn't capture what Bailey had done. They couldn't capture the screaming chaos of that night, the way Bailey had thrown himself into the fighting again and again, the way his presence had kept men fighting who might otherwise have broken. They couldn't capture what it meant to his men to watch him die. The fighting around the command post was apocalyptic. Marines and Japanese soldiers shot each other at point-blank range, stabbed each other with bayonets, threw grenades that exploded among both friend and foe. The noise was indescribable, screaming explosions, the crack of rifles and the chatter of machine guns, all merging into one continuous roar. Corporal Walter Burak manned a machine gun at the ridge's center, pouring fire into the Japanese assault. His gun was positioned at a slight bend in the ridge, giving him enfilade fire into the Japanese approach. Every time the enemy tried to advance, Burak's gun cut them down. When his gun jammed, Burak cleared it under fire. The problem was a broken extractor. A simple mechanical failure that would normally take a few minutes to fix. Burak fixed it in seconds, his hands moving automatically through a drill he had practiced 1,000 times, while Japanese bullets kicked up dirt all around him. When ammunition ran low, he sent runners to find more. One runner was killed. The second made it back with 2 cases of ammunition. Burak loaded a new belt and kept firing. When Japanese soldiers closed to within feet of his position, he killed them with his pistol and kept firing the machine gun with his other hand. One Japanese officer got close enough to swing a sword at Burak's head. Burak ducked the swing, shot the officer with his pistol, and went back to the machine gun. He was still there at dawn, his gun barrel glowing red from continuous firing, surrounded by piles of enemy dead. Burak estimated he had fired more than 3,000 rounds during the night. Other Marines thought it was more than that. Sergeant Mitchell Page, commanding another machine gun section, had a similar experience. His gun was positioned on a slight rise that commanded one of the main Japanese approaches. When the attack came, Page's section was directly in its path. The fighting around Page's position was desperate. Japanese soldiers overran nearby positions, killing Marines in their foxholes. Page's gun kept firing, sweeping the enemy approach, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. The barrel grew so hot that it glowed red in the darkness. One by one, Page's gun crew was killed or wounded. He kept firing. When his loader was killed, Page loaded the gun himself. When his assistant gunner was hit, Page took over his duties too. Eventually, Page was manning the gun alone, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. The Japanese sensed an opportunity. They massed for a final push against Page's isolated position. If they could silence that gun, they could break through and reach the airfield. Page saw them coming. He had maybe 100 rounds left, not enough to stop a determined assault. So he did something that shouldn't have been possible. He lifted the machine gun off its tripod, cradled it in his arms, and charged the Japanese. He screamed as he ran, holding the gun at hip level, pouring fire into the surprised Japanese ranks. The gun was burning his hands. The barrel was hot enough to cause severe burns. He kept firing. The Japanese broke. Men who had charged through artillery fire, who had kept coming despite terrible losses, turned and ran from this single Marine with his impossible gun. Page kept advancing, kept firing, until there were no more targets. Mitchell Page would also receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. He survived the war and lived until 2003, dying at age 85. He never forgot the men who died around his gun position, never stopped talking about the courage of the Marines who hadn't survived. At 0330 hours, Edson was forced to pull his men back to a final defensive line just a few hundred yards from Henderson Field. This was it, the last position. If this line broke, the Japanese would overrun the airfield and the entire Guadalcanal campaign would collapse. The Marines who fell back to that final line were running on fumes. They had been fighting for hours without rest, without water, without reinforcement. Many were wounded. All were exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried them through the early hours of the battle was fading, leaving only bone-deep weariness. Edson gathered his remaining officers and gave them their orders. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than their probable deaths. "This is where we hold," he said. "There is no falling back beyond this point." He looked at each officer in turn, making sure they understood. "We're not trading ground for time anymore. We're not conducting a fighting withdrawal. We're holding here until we win or until we're all dead. Those are the only two options." Nobody argued. There was nothing to argue about. The Marines spread out along their final line, taking what cover they could find, checking their ammunition, saying quiet prayers. Some of them wrote quick letters home, folded them carefully, tucked them into pockets. If they died, maybe someone would find the letters and send them. Others thought about family, about homes they might never see again, farms in Iowa, apartments in Brooklyn, houses in California, parents who were probably asleep right now, who had no idea that their sons were fighting for their lives on the other side of the world. The Japanese sensed victory. They gathered for one final assault, massing every man who could still fight for a push that would break the Marine lines and win the battle. Officers screamed exhortations, soldiers prayed to their ancestors and their emperor. Kawaguchi had committed everything to this attack. He had no reserves left. His supply lines were non-existent. His men were as exhausted as the Marines, but if they could break through now, all the suffering would be worth it. At 0400 hours, they attacked. What followed was 45 minutes of the most intense close combat of the Pacific War. The Japanese came in waves, screaming their battle cries, bayonets fixed, willing to die if they could just break through. The Marines met them with everything they had. Private Ray Cook, a barman from Company A, burned through magazine after magazine, his weapon growing so hot he could barely hold it. The BAR, Browning automatic rifle, was a heavy, powerful weapon that fired the same ammunition as the standard Marine rifle, but could put out far more volume of fire. In Cook's hands, it was devastating. When a Japanese officer charged him with a samurai sword, Cook shot him at a range of 3 feet. The officer was already swinging when Cook pulled the trigger. The bullet caught him in the chest and stopped him cold, the sword falling from his hands. Cook picked up the sword. Seconds later, another Japanese soldier came at him with a bayonet. Cook killed him with the sword, the officer's own weapon. He kept fighting until dawn, using his bar until the ammunition ran out, then using the sword, then using his rifle as a club. When the sun came up, Ray Cook was still alive, still holding his position, still ready to fight. Staff Sergeant Pete Pettis organized his squad into a tight circle, backs to each other, firing outward at Japanese soldiers who seemed to be everywhere at once. It was a desperate formation, one that you only used when you were completely surrounded and expecting to die. When the ammunition ran out, they fought with entrenching tools and fists. Pettis himself killed 3 Japanese soldiers with an entrenching tool, swinging it like an axe, breaking bones and skulls with each swing. When dawn came, Pettis was the only one of his squad still alive. The 11 other Marines who had formed that circle with him were all dead, their bodies arranged around the pile of Japanese dead they had created before they fell. The artillery fire that had been so effective earlier was now too dangerous to call in. The Japanese and Marines were too intermingled. This was going to be decided man to man, rifle to rifle, bayonet to bayonet. And somewhere in that chaos, the Japanese attack began to falter. It wasn't one thing, it was 1,000 things. Marines who should have broken didn't, positions that should have fallen held. The Japanese were taking casualties they couldn't replace, spending lives for yards of ground that meant nothing if they couldn't break through. Every time the Japanese seemed on the verge of breaking through, some Marine would do something extraordinary. Hold a position alone, lead a counterattack, man a gun until there were no more bullets to fire. The cumulative effect of these individual acts of heroism was to slow, then stop, then reverse the Japanese momentum. By 0500 hours, the Japanese assault had lost its momentum. Officers were dead, units were scattered. Soldiers who had fought all night without food or water were reaching the limits of human endurance. The attacks became more disorganized, more desperate. Individual Japanese soldiers charged Marine positions alone, seeking an honorable death rather than the shame of failure. Others simply collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to move. At 0530, the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the jungle. And with it came the sound that the Japanese feared most, American aircraft engines warming up on Henderson Field. The planes that took off from Henderson Field that morning were a motley collection. Marine Wildcats, Army P-400s, anything that could fly and fight. They had survived the previous night's bombardment. Their ground crews had worked through the fighting to repair damage and rearm, and now they were ready. They caught the retreating Japanese in the open, strafing and bombing columns that had nowhere to hide. The jungle that had provided concealment during the approach now trapped the survivors. They couldn't disperse quickly enough. They couldn't find cover. They died in droves. For the survivors of the night assault, it was the final blow. Men who had endured everything threw away their weapons and ran for the jungle. Unit cohesion collapsed. The carefully planned offensive became a rout. General Kawaguchi tried to rally his men. He walked among the fleeing soldiers, ordering them to turn and fight. Some listened. Most didn't. The attack was over, and everyone knew it. When the sun rose fully over Edson's Ridge on September 14, 1942, the scale of what had happened became clear. More than 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead on the ridge and in the jungle approaches. Hundreds more had been wounded. 2 of Kawaguchi's 3 battalions had been effectively destroyed as fighting units. The cream of the Japanese army on Guadalcanal, veterans of a dozen campaigns, elite soldiers who had never known defeat, had been broken against a thin line of American Marines. The raiders had lost 59 killed and more than 200 wounded. Nearly 1 in 3 men who had defended the ridge was a casualty. Every company had taken crippling losses. Some platoons had been virtually wiped out. But they had held. In the days that followed, Marine patrols pushed into the jungle, following the trail of the retreating Japanese. What they found was horrifying. Dead soldiers everywhere, some from wounds, some from starvation, some from disease. Men who had survived the battle only to die in the jungle afterward. Kawaguchi's force had essentially ceased to exist. Of the approximately 3,000 men who had attacked the ridge, fewer than half made it back to Japanese lines. The rest were dead, dying, or scattered through the jungle in small groups that would take weeks to reassemble. The battle that became known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge, sometimes called the Battle of the Bloody Ridge or the Battle of Raiders Ridge, was a turning point that went beyond the tactical. It was the moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility in land combat began to crack. For 7 months, Japanese soldiers had swept across Asia and the Pacific, defeating every army that faced them. Western colonial forces had collapsed in days. Chinese armies had retreated in disarray. The Japanese soldier was considered unstoppable, a fanatic warrior who would fight to the death and take 10 enemies with him. On that ridge in the Solomon Islands, American Marines proved that Japanese soldiers could be stopped. More than stopped, they could be defeated, broken, sent fleeing into the jungle. It wasn't easy, it cost lives, but it could be done. The psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For the Japanese, Edson's Ridge was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself across the Pacific. Their tactics, the mass banzai charge, the willingness to die rather than retreat, had worked against poorly trained colonial troops and demoralized Chinese armies. Against determined American Marines with automatic weapons and artillery support, those same tactics produced nothing but mountains of dead. General Kawaguchi himself recognized the failure. In his after-action report, he wrote that his men had faced an enemy far more formidable than they had been led to expect. The mystical power of Japanese spirit, the Bushido code that promised victory to the pure of heart, had proven insufficient against American firepower and American will. For the Americans, the battle provided something equally important: hope. After months of defeat and retreat, after Pearl Harbor and the Philippines and Wake Island, American fighting men had proven they could stand against the best Japan had to offer. They could take the worst the enemy could throw at them and throw it back in their faces. The news of the victory spread through the Pacific Fleet, through the Marine Corps, through the American public. It wasn't the end of the fighting on Guadalcanal. That would drag on for another 5 months. It wasn't the end of the war. That was still 3 years away. But it was a sign that the tide could turn, that Japan could be beaten, that the long road back would eventually reach Tokyo itself. Merritt Edson received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the battle. His calm under fire, his tactical flexibility, and his personal courage became legendary within the Marine Corps. The image of Red Mike walking his lines under Japanese fire, chewing his unlit cigar and telling his men to hold on, became part of Marine Corps lore. Edson's citation noted his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous intrepidity, and his outstanding gallantry and valiant devotion to duty. But like all Medal of Honor citations, it couldn't really capture what had happened. It couldn't capture the 14 hours of continuous combat, the constant movement from crisis point to crisis point, the decisions that had to be made in seconds with lives hanging in the balance. Edson survived the war and rose to the rank of Major General, but the battle left its marks on him, as it did on all who survived it. He struggled with what we would now call post-traumatic stress and took his own life in 1955. He was 58 years old. The men who fought under Edson, the raiders who held that ridge against overwhelming odds, scattered after the war. They went home to farms and factories, to offices and classrooms. They married, had children, grew old. Most never talked about what they had seen and done in those 14 hours of darkness. But they remembered. John Sweeney survived his wounds and became a lawyer in San Francisco. He built a successful practice, raised a family, never let anyone call him a hero. When people asked about the war, he changed the subject. The only time he talked about it was with other veterans, men who had been there, who understood. Ray Cook went back to his family's ranch in Texas and raised cattle for 40 years. The sword he took from that Japanese officer hung over his fireplace until the day he died. His grandchildren asked about it sometimes. He would touch the sword, look at it for a long moment, and then tell them it was just something he picked up during the war. Walter Burak, the machine gunner who held the center of the line, became a high school football coach in Pennsylvania. He was known for his calm demeanor, for never raising his voice, for treating his players with quiet respect. His players never knew that their coach had killed more than 200 men in a single night. He never told them. He never told anyone. Pete Pettis, the sergeant who was the sole survivor of his squad, couldn't settle down after the war. He drifted from job to job, state to state, unable to find peace. The faces of the men who had died around him haunted his dreams. He drank too much, fought too much, couldn't hold on to relationships or jobs or anything that felt like a normal life. In 1962, Pettis returned to Guadalcanal, now an independent nation, and spent a week walking the ridge, looking for something he could never quite name. He found some rusted equipment, some overgrown foxholes, nothing more. The jungle had reclaimed the battlefield. There was no sign of the men who had died there, American or Japanese. Pettis died in 1978, still searching for peace he never found. His friends said the war never really ended for him. The faces of his squadmates visited him in his dreams until the very end. He never married, never had children, never built the kind of life his friends had died to protect. The guilt of surviving when others hadn't was a burden he carried to his grave. Some survivors found ways to make meaning from their experience. They became teachers, passing on the lessons they had learned. They became doctors, trying to heal others the way they wished they could have healed their friends. They became coaches, leaders, mentors, finding ways to serve that didn't require them to kill. Others found peace in family, in work, in the simple routines of civilian life. They got up in the morning, went to their jobs, came home to their wives and children. They watched their grandchildren play in yards that seemed impossibly green and peaceful after the mud and blood of Guadalcanal. They grew old, surrounded by people who loved them, people who would never fully understand what they had been through. A few returned to the Marine Corps, making a career of the profession that had shaped them. They served in Korea, some of them in Vietnam. They trained new generations of Marines, passing on the lessons of Edson's Ridge, making sure the sacrifice of their friends would never be forgotten. The ridge itself has changed little in 80 years. The kunai grass still grows thick in the rainy season. The jungle still presses in from all sides. If you visit today, local guides will show you foxholes that have survived since 1942, rusting ammunition still scattered in the undergrowth. The guides tell stories that have been passed down through generations. Stories of the terrible night when the sky itself seemed to be on fire, when the sound of battle echoed off the hills for miles, when the bodies were so thick in some places that you couldn't walk without stepping on them. On certain nights, they say, you can still hear echoes of that battle, the crack of rifles, the screams of the wounded, the thunder of Japanese voices raised in their final charge. The locals don't go to the ridge after dark. They say it belongs to the dead now. But what the dead taught us, what Edson and Bailey and Sweeney and all the others proved on that terrible night, was something the living desperately needed to know. They proved that courage and determination and the willingness to sacrifice could overcome even the most fanatical enemy. They proved that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. They proved that ordinary men, pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, could achieve something extraordinary. The Battle of Edson's Ridge lasted 14 hours. In those 14 hours, the course of a war was changed. 800 Marines stopped 3,000 elite Japanese soldiers, not because they had better weapons or superior numbers, but because they refused to break. In the years since, military historians have analyzed every aspect of the battle. They've studied the terrain, the tactics, the weapons employed. They've debated decisions and second-guessed commanders. They've written books and papers and dissertations. But all their analysis comes down to a simple truth. On the night of September 13, 1942, a small group of American Marines decided they would rather die than give up one more inch of ground, and that decision changed history. The story of Edson's Ridge is not just a story of military tactics or strategic importance. It's a story about what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. It's a story about sacrifice, about courage, about the bonds that form between men who face death together. It's a story that deserves to be remembered. Guadalcanal itself became the graveyard of Japanese offensive power in the Pacific. After the failure at Edson's Ridge, the Japanese launched two more major assaults on Henderson Field. Both failed with heavy casualties. By February 1943, Japan had evacuated its surviving troops from the island, conceding defeat for the first time in the war. The campaign cost Japan approximately 30,000 soldiers killed, along with hundreds of aircraft and dozens of ships. American losses were also significant, approximately 7,000 killed, but the difference in strategic outcome was enormous. Japan had lost the initiative. From this point forward, they would be on the defensive. The Japanese soldier who fought on Guadalcanal was no less brave than his American counterpart. Many of them displayed extraordinary courage in hopeless situations. They charged into certain death without hesitation. They refused to surrender even when resistance was clearly futile. They died by the thousands for an emperor who had never met them, and a cause that was already lost. But bravery alone wasn't enough. The tactics that had worked so well against colonial armies, the mass charges, the infiltration attacks, the refusal to retreat, proved catastrophically ill-suited against American firepower and American determination. The lessons of Edson's Ridge echoed through the rest of the Pacific War. At Tarawa and Saipan, at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the pattern repeated itself. Japanese soldiers fought with suicidal bravery, and American Marines and soldiers ground them down with firepower and persistence. The cost was terrible on both sides, but the outcome was never really in doubt after Guadalcanal. The ridge that bears Edson's name today is quiet most of the time. Tour groups occasionally visit, following guides who point out where Company B made its stand, where Bailey fell, where Edson had his command post. The jungle has reclaimed much of the battlefield, but occasional artifacts still emerge. A rusted canteen, a corroded bayonet, the bones of men whose families never learned their fate. In Japan, the survivors of Kawaguchi's brigade returned home to find a nation that didn't want to hear about defeat. The Japanese government maintained strict control over information about the war, and Guadalcanal was presented as a strategic withdrawal rather than the disaster it actually was. The survivors knew the truth, of course. They knew that their comrades had died by the thousands, not in glorious combat, but from starvation, disease, and despair. They knew that the tactics they had been taught, the banzai charges, the refusal to retreat, the contempt for enemies they were supposed to despise, had led to catastrophe. Some of these survivors became advocates for peace after the war, dedicated to ensuring that future generations would never experience what they had experienced. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews, traveled to former battlefields to pay respects to fallen friends and former enemies alike. Others remained silent, unable or unwilling to speak about what they had seen. They lived with their memories in private, sharing them only with fellow veterans who could understand. They grew old in a Japan that had been transformed by defeat, a nation that had renounced war and embraced pacifism, a transformation that some of them supported and others found hard to accept. The Japanese soldiers who died on Edson's Ridge were not monsters. They were young men, most of them drafted into service, fighting for a cause they believed in with the same intensity that the Marines believed in theirs. They had families who loved them, mothers who wept when the death notices arrived, fathers who bore their grief in stoic silence. The tragedy of war is that it forces ordinary people to kill each other, people who, in different circumstances, might have been friends. The Marines who fought on Edson's Ridge had no particular hatred for the individual Japanese soldiers they killed. They were simply doing their jobs, trying to survive, trying to protect the men next to them. The same was true of the Japanese. They had been told that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of real fighting. They learned differently on Edson's Ridge. Some of them lived long enough to revise their opinions of the enemy. Most didn't. War is wasteful. It consumes the best young men a nation has to offer, spending their lives for objectives that sometimes seem impossibly small. A ridge, a field, a few hundred yards of jungle. But sometimes those objectives matter. Sometimes holding one ridge means changing the course of a war. Edson's Ridge was one of those times. The war continued for 3 more years after Guadalcanal. They interviewed survivors, studied documents, walked the battlefield. What they found was a story of extraordinary courage on both sides and a tactical approach that was fundamentally flawed. In America, the Battle of Edson's Ridge became part of Marine Corps legend, proof that Marines could hold against any odds, that the Corps would never break, that no better friend, no worse enemy was more than just a motto. Young Marines still learn about Edson's stand in their basic training, still visit the memorials at Quantico and San Diego, still draw inspiration from men who died before their grandparents were born. The lessons of the battle are still taught at military academies around the world. The importance of terrain, the value of artillery coordination, the critical nature of small unit leadership, all of these are illustrated by what happened on Edson's Ridge. But the most important lesson is harder to teach, harder to quantify. It's the lesson that some things are worth dying for, that there are lines that cannot be crossed, positions that cannot be abandoned, principles that cannot be compromised, that when everything else has failed, when all other options have been exhausted, ordinary people can find the strength to do extraordinary things. The men who held that ridge didn't know they were making history. They didn't know their actions would be analyzed and debated for generations. They were just trying to survive the night, to protect the men next to them, to do their jobs. But history is made by such men, in such moments. The great sweep of events that we read about in textbooks is really just the accumulation of individual choices, individual acts of courage or cowardice, individual decisions to stand or to run. On the night of September 13th, 1942, 800 men chose to stand. That choice, repeated in 1,000 foxholes, in 100 desperate moments, added up to something far greater than any individual could have achieved alone. It added up to victory. The names of most of those men are lost to history now. They lie in military cemeteries across the Pacific or in small-town graveyards across America, or their ashes were scattered on battlefields that have since been reclaimed by the jungle. We don't know their faces, their voices, their dreams for the future they might never see, but we know what they did. We know they held. And in knowing that, we know something important about what human beings are capable of at their best. The story of Edson's Ridge is a story about war, yes, but it's also a story about humanity, about the depths of darkness we can descend to and the heights of courage we can reach. It's a story that reminds us, in an age of comfort and safety, that our world was built on the sacrifices of people who had neither. It's a story that matters. So the next time you hear about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, soldiers holding a position against impossible odds, firefighters running into burning buildings, strangers risking their lives for people they've never met, remember Edson's Ridge. Remember that such things are possible. Remember that they happen more often than we might think. And remember to be grateful to those who came before us, who paid prices we can barely imagine, so that we could live in the world they helped create. That's the legacy of the 800. That's what they gave us on that ridge, in that darkness, in that war that changed everything. They gave us tomorrow. And tomorrow, for all its problems, for all its challenges, for all the work still left to do, tomorrow is worth fighting for. They knew that. They proved it. Now it's our turn to remember. The sun sets over Guadalcanal just as it did 80 years ago. The jungle grows quiet. The stars come out, the same stars that 800 Marines watched as they waited for dawn, wondering if they would live to see it. Most of them didn't, but they held the ridge, and because they held, others could follow. Because they held, Henderson Field remained in American hands. Because they held, the tide of Japanese expansion finally reached its high-water mark and began to recede. Because they held, we remember, 800 men, one ridge, 14 hours, and the world was never the same. That's the story of Edson's Ridge, a story of courage beyond measure, of sacrifice beyond calculation, of ordinary men who found something extraordinary within themselves when everything depended on it. It happened. It mattered. It changed history. The weeks and months that followed Edson's Ridge saw continued fighting on Guadalcanal, but the outcome was never really in doubt after that September night. The Japanese launched two more major offensives against Henderson Field, one in October and one in November, and both were defeated with heavy losses. The October offensive, led by Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, was even larger than Kawaguchi's assault. Maruyama brought nearly 7,000 men through the jungle, following a route that took them through terrain even more brutal than what Kawaguchi's force had faced. His troops called the route the Trail of Death, and with good reason. Men collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, and disease. Entire units became lost in the jungle and were never heard from again. When Maruyama's force finally reached the marine perimeter, they attacked with the same banzai tactics that had failed so spectacularly on Edson's Ridge, and they met the same fate. The Marines, reinforced now by army troops and dug into prepared positions, slaughtered the attackers with machine guns, artillery, and air power. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers died in the 2 nights of fighting. The November offensive was the last serious Japanese attempt to take Henderson Field. By this point, the Japanese High Command was beginning to understand the scale of their mistake. Guadalcanal had become a black hole, swallowing reinforcements, supplies, and ships faster than Japan could replace them. The Tokyo Express was running every night, but it couldn't keep up with the losses. By December 1942, the Japanese situation on Guadalcanal was desperate. Their forces were starving, riddled with disease, and hopelessly outnumbered. The elaborate plans to take Henderson Field had given way to a simple goal: survival. Men who had come to Guadalcanal expecting victory were now wondering if they would live to see another week. The Japanese called Guadalcanal the Island of Death. Soldiers who served there and survived would never forget the horrors they had witnessed: friends dying of starvation, officers committing suicide rather than face the shame of failure, men reduced to eating grass and tree bark in a desperate attempt to stay alive. In early February 1943, the Japanese High Command made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. They ordered the evacuation of Guadalcanal. The Emperor's soldiers were retreating from conquered territory for the first time in the war. The evacuation was conducted at night, over several nights, with the same destroyers of the Tokyo Express that had brought the soldiers to the island in the first place. About 13,000 soldiers were evacuated, all that remained of the nearly 40,000 Japanese troops who had served on Guadalcanal during the 6-month campaign. The rest, more than 25,000 men, had died. Some were killed in combat. Many more died of disease, starvation, and exposure. Their bodies lay scattered across the island, in the jungle, on the beaches, on ridges that would forever bear the scars of their final charges. The American victory at Guadalcanal was complete, but it had come at a tremendous cost. Nearly 7,000 Americans had died during the campaign, about 1,600 in ground combat, the rest to disease and naval losses. Thousands more were wounded, many of them carrying physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. But the strategic significance of the victory could not be overstated. Guadalcanal proved that Japan could be beaten. It proved that the invincible Japanese army was, in fact, quite vincible when faced with determined defenders and superior firepower. It provided a model for the island-hopping campaigns that would eventually bring American forces to the doorstep of Japan itself. And it began with Edson's Ridge. In the decades since the battle, historians have debated various aspects of what happened on that September night. Some have questioned whether Edson's tactics were optimal. Others have argued about the exact number of Japanese casualties. A few have suggested that the strategic importance of the battle has been overstated. But no one disputes the essential truth of what happened. 800 Marines, exhausted and outnumbered, held a ridge against 3,000 Japanese soldiers through 14 hours of continuous combat. They did it through raw courage, tactical skill, and an absolute refusal to quit. They did it because they were Marines, and Marines don't give up. The survivors of Edson's Ridge went on to fight in other battles, other campaigns, other wars. Some served in the Pacific until the Japanese surrender in 1945. Others were rotated home and spent the rest of the war training the next generation of Marines. A few were wounded so severely that their fighting days were over. But all of them carried Guadalcanal with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen things that most people couldn't imagine, had done things that they would never fully be able to explain. They had been tested in the most extreme circumstances and had not been found wanting. That's worth something. That's worth remembering. The lessons of Edson's Ridge are still relevant today, more than 80 years after the battle was fought. They are lessons about leadership, about how a commander's presence and calm under fire can inspire men to achieve the impossible. They are lessons about preparation, about how careful planning and understanding of terrain can multiply the effectiveness of a smaller force. They are lessons about courage, about how ordinary people can find extraordinary strength when everything is on the line. They are also lessons about the human cost of war. The men who died on that ridge, American and Japanese alike, were young men, most of them in their teens and 20s. They had families who loved them, dreams they would never fulfill, lives they would never live. Their sacrifice bought something precious: freedom, security, the chance for future generations to live in peace. But the price was terrible. We owe it to them to remember that price. We owe it to them to honor their sacrifice not just with words, but with the way we live our lives. They gave everything so that we could have everything. The least we can do is remember. The ridge still stands in the Solomon Islands, covered now with jungle growth that has reclaimed most of the battlefield. The foxholes have filled in, the shell craters have smoothed over, the kunai grass waves in the tropical breeze, just as it did on that September night so long ago. But if you listen carefully, the old-timers say, you can still hear echoes of that battle, the crack of rifles, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of men fighting and dying in the darkness. The ridge remembers, and so should we. The story of Edson's Ridge is not just a story about war. It's a story about what human beings are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. It's a story about sacrifice, about duty, about the bonds that form between men who face death together. It's a story that speaks to something deep in the human spirit, our capacity for courage, for endurance, for refusing to give up even when all hope seems lost. That's why we tell this story. That's why we remember these men. That's why their sacrifice still matters, more than 8 decades after they made it. They held the ridge, they changed history, they showed the world what courage looks like, and now you know their story. Never forget. 800 men, 1 ridge, 14 hours. And the world was never the same again.